At 6 feet and 3 inches tall, Margaret Thompson had been told her entire life that she was too much woman for any man to handle. Standing on the platform at Pine Ridge Station in 1892, clutching a carpetbag and a crumpled letter, she wondered if the mountains of Oregon might finally hold someone who could make her feel small. What happened next would prove that sometimes God has a sense of humor about perfect matches. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The timber town of Pine Ridge sat carved into the mountainside. Like a scar on green velvet, all rough-hewn buildings, and mud-thick streets that spoke of men who worked with their hands and had little time for prettiness. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, mixing with the fog that clung to the towering pines, and the air carried the bite of coming winter, along with the sweet scent of fresh-cut lumber. Margaret Thompson stepped down from the stagecoach with the careful grace of someone who had learned to fold herself small in a world built for shorter people. Her traveling dress, a sensible brown wool that had seen better days, hung loose around her frame, not from poor tailoring, but because seamstresses in Chicago had long ago given up trying to make her look delicate. At 6 feet and 3 inches, in her stockings, with shoulders that could carry firewood and hands that weren't afraid of honest work, Maggie had been called handsome more often than beautiful, sturdy more often than feminine. The other passengers barely glanced her way as they collected their belongings. She had learned to be invisible despite her height, to duck her head and speak softly and pretend she didn't notice when men looked past her to find someone who would make them feel bigger rather than smaller. The letter in her pocket had promised something different. Thomas Sawyer, it read in careful block letters, seeking a wife of good character and strong constitution for life in timber country. Must not mind isolation or hard work. Physical appearance less important than moral fiber and ability to care for one child. Physical appearance less important. Those words had sung to her like a hymn. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man who barely reached her shoulder, handed down her trunk with a grunt. "You sure this is where you want to be, miss? Ain't much here for a lady of your refinement." Maggie almost laughed. Refinement. If only he knew how many times she'd been passed over at church socials, how many suitors had taken one look at her and decided they needed someone who would make them feel heroic rather than diminished. Her last serious caller, Henry Morrison back in Illinois, had courted her for 3 months before admitting he couldn't bear the thought of his wife looking down at him on their wedding day. "I'm expected," she said simply, though her stomach clenched around the uncertainty. The letter had been brief, practical, more like a business arrangement than a proposal. But Thomas Sawyer had signed it "Sincerely yours," and something in those carefully formed letters had suggested a man who meant what he wrote. Pine Ridge's main street stretched before her like a challenge, all saloons and supply stores and roughly dressed men who stopped their conversations to stare as she passed. Their eyes weren't unkind, just curious, the way folks looked at anything unusual that wandered into their small world. A woman emerged from the general store, wiping her hands on her apron, and approached with the determined stride of someone accustomed to being the first to greet newcomers. "You must be the bride," she said, looking Maggie up and down with frank assessment. "I'm Clara Jenkins. Run the store with my husband." She paused, tilting her head back to meet Maggie's eyes. Lord Almighty, Tom wasn't joking when he said he needed someone substantial. Heat crept up Maggie's neck. Even here, even before she'd met the man who'd summoned her across half the continent, her size was the first thing people noticed. "I'm Margaret Thompson. Mr. Sawyer was expecting me on today's stage." Clara's expression softened. "Course he was, honey. He's up at the mill, but he'll be down directly. Come on into the store and warm yourself. That mountain air's got teeth, and you look half frozen." The inside of Jenkins' general store smelled of coffee and leather and the faint sweetness of penny candy in glass jars. Clara bustled behind the counter, pouring steaming coffee from a pot that had clearly been sitting on the stove since dawn. The liquid was strong enough to wake the dead and bitter as regret, but it warmed Maggie's hands through the thick ceramic mug. "Been corresponding with Tom long?" Clara asked, settling herself on a stool behind the counter with the air of someone preparing for a good conversation. "3 months, Maggie replied, though calling their exchange correspondence felt generous. His letters had been sparse, practical things that told her about the climate and the work and his daughter's need for feminine influence, but revealed little about the man himself. She'd written back with equal restraint, describing her experience, keeping house for her widowed father and her ability to handle farm chores, without mentioning the loneliness that had driven her to answer an advertisement in the first place. "He's a good man," Clara said, studying Maggie's face with the intensity of someone reading tea leaves. "Lost his wife when Emma was born. Been raising that child alone for 8 years, working himself near to death at the mill. Doesn't say much. But then again, most folks around here let their actions do the talking." The store's bell chimed, and both women turned toward the door. What walked through it made Maggie's coffee cup freeze halfway to her lips. Thomas Sawyer had to duck under the doorframe, and even then his shoulders nearly brushed both sides. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, maybe more, with the kind of broad, powerful build that came from years of handling timber and machinery. His dark hair was damp with sweat despite the cold, his flannel shirt rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they could lift a grown man without strain. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath gray as storm clouds, careful and kind, with lines at the corners that spoke of someone who smiled more than he frowned. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret Thompson had to look up at a man. He pulled off his cap, revealing hair that needed cutting, and nodded to Clara before his gaze found Maggie. She saw him take in her height, her broad shoulders, the way she sat straight back on the stool without trying to make herself smaller. Something shifted in his expression, not disappointment, but something closer to relief. "Miss Thompson." His voice was deep, quiet, the kind that didn't need to be raised to command attention. "I'm Thomas Sawyer. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." She stood, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, two people who had spent their lives being too much for the world around them. He was still taller, still broader, but for the first time since she'd started growing at 12 and hadn't stopped until she towered over her entire family, Maggie felt proportional. "The journey was fine," she managed, her voice steadier than her pulse. "Thank you for the opportunity." Something flickered across his face at her choice of words. Opportunity. Not invitation. Not welcome. But the careful language of someone who had learned not to expect too much. Clara cleared her throat. "Well, I'll just leave you two to get acquainted. Tom, you make sure Miss Thompson gets settled proper." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "And bring Emma by tomorrow. She's been chattering about meeting her new mama for weeks." New mama. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with assumption and hope and the weight of expectations neither of them had quite agreed to yet. Thomas shifted his weight, and Maggie caught a glimpse of uncertainty beneath his calm exterior. "Emma's at school," he said, as if Clara's comment required explanation. "Should be eager to meet you. She's been asking when you'd arrive since I got your last letter." Maggie nodded, though her stomach fluttered at the thought of meeting the child who might become her daughter. In her letters she described her experience helping raise her younger cousins, but the truth was more complicated. She'd watched other women mother their children from the outside, learned emotions without ever feeling certain she possessed whatever instinct made it look natural. Thomas picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing, which it decidedly did. "Not. I've got the wagon outside. The cabin's about a mile up the creek. It's simple, but it's warm and sound." They walked out into the afternoon chill, and Maggie was grateful for his presence beside her. The curious stares of the townspeople felt less intrusive with Thomas's substantial frame blocking some of them. He helped her into the wagon with a careful courtesy that suggested he was as uncertain about the proper etiquette of this situation as she was. The road to his cabin wound through stands of pine and fir so tall they seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. Thomas drove in comfortable silence, and Maggie found herself stealing glances at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins with easy competence, the fact that she could study his face without craning her neck upward. "The winters here are hard," he said eventually, as if feeling obligated to prepare her for what she'd gotten herself into. "Snow can last until April. Town gets cut off sometimes for weeks at a time." "I grew up in northern Illinois," she replied. "I'm familiar with hard winters." He nodded, and she sensed approval in the gesture. "The work's hard, too. Mill keeps me busy from dawn to dusk most days. Emma's independent, but she needs guidance, women's guidance." Maggie heard what he wasn't saying, that he was overwhelmed, that raising a daughter alone while running a demanding job had stretched him beyond his limits. It wasn't romance he was offering, but partnership, the kind of practical arrangement that made sense on the frontier, where survival often mattered more than sentiment. "I'm not afraid of work," she said, and meant it. "Hard work never killed anyone, but loneliness might." The words slipped out before she could stop them, more honest than she'd intended. Thomas glanced at her, and something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what she meant. The cabin sat in a clearing beside Timber Creek, surrounded by stumps that spoke of the forest that had once stood there. It was larger than she'd expected, built of hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney that breathed thin smoke into the gray sky. A small garden plot stretched along the south side, dormant now but well-tended, and a chicken coop sat near a modest barn. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. There was something solid and permanent about the place, something that spoke of a man who built things to last. Thomas carried her trunk inside without comment, and Maggie followed, ducking slightly under the doorframe from habit before realizing she didn't need to. The interior was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture that showed more skill than artistry. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the smell of something savory drifted from a pot hanging over the flames. "Emma's been practicing her cooking," Thomas explained, noticing her glance toward the kitchen. "She wanted everything perfect for when you arrived." The thoughtfulness behind the gesture touched something tender in Maggie's chest. She'd spent so many years feeling like an inconvenience, a woman too tall and too strong for anyone's comfort, that the idea of being anticipated, prepared for, welcomed, felt almost foreign. "She sounds like a considerate child." "She is. Sometimes too much so. Tries to take care of everyone around her." His voice carried a note of worry that suggested he recognized the burden his daughter had taken on in the absence of a mother's guidance. Footsteps thundered on the porch, followed by the bang of the door opening. A whirlwind of brown braids and patched dress burst through, shattering before she was fully inside. "Papa, did she come?" Mrs. Jenkins said the stage was O. The girl stopped mid-sentence, blue eyes wide as she took in Maggie's height. But instead of the disappointment or discomfort Maggie had learned to expect from children, Emma's face lit up with something approaching wonder. "You're tall like Papa," she said with the frank directness of childhood. "I was worried you'd be tiny like Mrs. Henderson and make me feel like a giant baby." Thomas's mouth twitched with what might have been amusement. "Emma, mind your manners. This is Miss Thompson. Are you going to be my new mama?" Emma asked, stepping closer with the fearless curiosity of someone who had never learned to be intimidated by size or difference. The question hung in the air, simple and complex all at once. Maggie looked from the child's hopeful face to Thomas's carefully neutral expression, feeling the weight of expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. "I hope we can be friends first," she said carefully, "and see how that goes." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. That's what Papa said. He said you can't make someone care about you, but you can give them reasons to want to try. The wisdom in the child's words suggested conversations between father and daughter that had prepared her for this moment. Maggie felt something tight. In her chest began to loosen. Whatever else happened, it was clear that Thomas Sawyer was raising his daughter with honesty and kindness. The afternoon passed in careful conversation and shared tasks. Emma showed Maggie around the cabin with the pride of someone presenting her life's work, pointing out the root cellar Papa had dug, the loft where she slept, the corner where she kept her collection of interesting stones. Thomas moved around them with quiet efficiency, banking the fire and checking the evening chores, his presence steady and unobtrusive. When supper time came, they sat around the rough wooden table eating Emma's carefully prepared stew and cornbread. The food was simple but well made, and Maggie found herself relaxing into the rhythm of family conversation. Emma chattered about school and her friends and the baby owl she'd found with a broken wing, while Thomas listened with the patience of someone accustomed to his daughter's enthusiastic storytelling. "Miss Thompson," Emma said suddenly, fixing Maggie with serious blue eyes, "are you going to make Papa smile more?" The question caught both adults off guard. Thomas's spoon paused halfway to his mouth, and Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Emma," Thomas said quietly, but not unkindly. "It's all right," Maggie said, meeting the child's direct gaze. "I don't know yet, Emma, but I'd like to try." It was an honest answer, perhaps more honest than the situation called for, but Emma nodded as if it satisfied something important in her 8-year-old understanding of the world. As darkness fell over the mountains, Thomas showed Maggie to the small bedroom off the main room that would be hers. It was simply furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings, but the quilt on the bed was beautiful, pieced together from scraps in a pattern that spoke of careful planning and patient work. "Emma's mother made that," he said, following her gaze. "Thought you should know." The honesty of it touched her. Another man might have hidden evidence of his first wife, but Thomas seemed to understand that respect for what came before was different from being trapped. "Buy it. It's beautiful work," Maggie said softly. She must have been a skilled seamstress. She was. He paused in the doorway, seemed to struggle with something, then said, "I want you to know, Miss Thompson, that this arrangement, it doesn't have to be more than what you're comfortable with. There's no pressure for anything beyond what we agreed to in our letters." The careful kindness in his voice, the way he offered her agency in a situation where many men would have assumed rights, told her more about his character than months of correspondence could have. Here was a man who understood that respect was the foundation of any relationship worth having. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. "That means more than you might know." He nodded and withdrew, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the mountain silence that pressed against the windows. Maggie unpacked her few belongings slowly, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her books on the single shelf. Everything she owned fit easily in the small space, a testament to a life that had been about waiting rather than living. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean waves, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate. For the first time in years, Margaret Thompson fell asleep without feeling like an inconvenience to the world around her. In this place, with these people, her sighs felt like strength rather than burden, and the possibility of belonging settled over her like that beautiful quilt, warm and carefully made to last. Margaret woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat made of steel and timber. Gray dawn light filtered through the simple curtains, and for a moment she lay still, remembering where she was and why. The bed beneath her was firm, the quilt warm, and somewhere beyond these walls a man twice her size was already at work, splitting kindling for the morning fire. She dressed quickly in the dim light, choosing her most practical dress and pinning her auburn hair back in a style that would stay tidy through whatever the day might bring. The cabin was quiet except for that steady chopping, and she could smell coffee brewing and bacon beginning to sizzle. Emma, it seemed, was as early a riser as her father. The main room glowed with firelight and the soft warmth of oil lamps. Emma stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up and an apron wrapped twice around her small waist, tending breakfast with the serious concentration of someone who took her responsibilities to heart. She looked up as Maggie entered, her face brightening with genuine pleasure. "Good morning, Miss Thompson. I hope the chopping didn't wake you. Papa tries to be quiet, but the wood doesn't care much about sleeping folks." Maggie smiled at the child's matter-of-fact observation. "I've always been an early riser. Can I help with breakfast?" Emma's eyes lit up. "Would you?" "I can manage the cooking, but setting the table proper like always makes me nervous. Mama used to say presentation was just as important as preparation." The casual mention of her mother carried no sadness, just the comfortable familiarity of someone who had learned to keep good memories close without letting them become painful. Maggie found herself admiring the way Thomas had clearly taught his daughter to honor her mother's memory without being imprisoned by it. They worked together in comfortable silence, Emma directing the placement of plates and cups with the gravity of someone orchestrating something far more complex than breakfast. Through the window, Maggie could see Thomas's tall form moving between the woodpile and the barn, his movements efficient and purposeful. Even in the dim morning light, his size was impressive, not just his height but the breadth of his shoulders, and the easy way he handled timber that would have challenged smaller men. The door opened with a gust of cold air, and Thomas entered, brushing wood chips from his shirt and stamping snow from his boots. His hair was damp with exertion, despite the cold, and when he looked up and saw Maggie helping Emma with breakfast, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly, but something warmer. Approval, perhaps, or simply the quiet satisfaction of seeing his world function smoothly. "Morning, Miss Thompson. I hope Emma didn't wake you with her breakfast preparations. She's been planning this meal since yesterday." "I was already awake," Maggie replied, ladling scrambled eggs onto a platter. "And please, call me Margaret, or Maggie if you prefer." He nodded, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "Maggie, then." "And I'm Tom." The exchange felt significant somehow, a small step away from the formal distance they'd maintained in their correspondence. Breakfast was a revelation of small domestic pleasures Maggie had never experienced. Sitting at a table with people who wanted her there, passing dishes and sharing the comfortable conversation of a family starting their day together. Emma chattered about her plans for school. Tom mentioned repairs needed at the mill, and somehow Maggie found herself part of the rhythm, asked for opinions and included in decisions as naturally as if she'd been there for years rather than hours. "The Hendersons are having a barn raising next week," Tom said, cutting his bacon with precise movements. "Most of the community will be there. Good chance for you to meet folks, if you're inclined." The careful way he phrased it told Maggie he was giving her a choice, not assuming she'd want to be displayed before the entire community like a prize heifer at a county fair. She appreciated the consideration, even as she felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of being scrutinized by Pine Ridge's entire population. "I'd like that," she said. "I imagine people are curious." Emma giggled. "Mrs. Jenkins has been telling everyone about how tall you are. She said you make Papa look almost normal-sized." Tom's mouth twitched with what might have been amusement, but he directed a gentle look at his daughter. "People's curiosity isn't always kind, Emma. Remember that when you're talking about Miss Maggie." The protective note in his voice caught Maggie off guard. She'd expected practical courtesy, perhaps even grudging acceptance, but this felt like something more. Like he was already thinking of her as someone under his care, someone whose feelings mattered to him. After breakfast, Tom prepared to leave. For the mill, gathering his lunch pail and checking the contents with the systematic attention of someone whose work was both dangerous and demanding. Emma gathered her school books and slate, moving with the practiced efficiency of a child accustomed to managing her own preparations. "I'll walk Emma to school," Tom said, settling his hat on his dark hair. "It's on my way to the mill." "Will you be all right here alone?" The question was practical, but Maggie heard the underlying concern. He was leaving his home, his private space, in her care, trusting her with the domestic kingdom he and Emma had built together. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "I thought I might explore a bit, get familiar with the place." Emma bounced on, her toes with sudden excitement. "Oh, you should see the creek, Miss Maggie. And there's a meadow just up the hill where Papa says deer come to drink. And if you follow the path behind the barn, there's the most beautiful view of the whole valley." Tom listened to his daughter's enthusiastic directions with patient attention, then added quietly, "Just stay within sight of the cabin for now. These mountains can be tricky for folks who don't know them." Again, that note of protection, of concern for her welfare that went beyond mere politeness. Maggie nodded, touched by his care despite the independent part of her that bristled at being told where she could and couldn't go. They left together, Emma skipping ahead while Tom's longer stride easily kept pace. Maggie watched from the window until they disappeared around a bend in the trail, noting how Emma chattered constantly while Tom listened with the focused attention of someone who found his daughter's observations genuinely interesting. Alone in the cabin, Maggie took stock of her new world. The space was larger than it had seemed the night before, with clever built-in storage and furniture that showed both skill and thoughtfulness in its construction. The kitchen was well organized, stocked with basics but clearly designed by someone who valued function over flourish. Tom's bedroom door stood open, revealing a space as spare and practical as the man himself, dominated by a bed that looked hand-built to accommodate his unusual size. She found herself lingering in the doorway, noting details that revealed character. Books stacked on a small table, their titles spanning practical manuals and classical literature. A photograph of a woman holding a baby, the faces too worn to make out clearly, but the love in the pose unmistakable. Work clothes folded neatly on a chair, testament to a man who took care of his possessions, because replacement wasn't easy in this remote place. The day passed in exploration and quiet work. Maggie walked the boundaries of the cleared land, noting the garden plot and the small orchard of fruit trees that would bloom come spring. She found the meadow Emma had mentioned, a natural clearing where the grass grew thick and sweet, perfect for grazing animals or simply sitting quietly to think. The view from the rise behind the barn was indeed spectacular, revealing the entire valley spread below like a green and brown quilt stitched together with silver streams. But it was the domestic details that captured her attention most fully. The way Emma had organized the root cellar with military precision. The careful repair work Tom had done on everything from broken hinges to loose floorboards. The small touches that spoke of people making a life together, not just surviving but creating something worth preserving. She spent the afternoon cleaning, not because the cabin was dirty, but because it felt like contributing, like beginning to weave herself into the fabric of this place. She swept floors that didn't need sweeping and organized cupboards that were already tidy, but the work felt satisfying in a way that cleaning her father's house never had. This wasn't drudgery imposed by duty, but care offered by choice. When Emma bounded through the door that afternoon, cheeks pink from cold and eyes bright with excitement, she stopped short at the sight of the immaculate kitchen and the smell of bread baking in the oven. "Miss Maggie, you didn't have to do all this work." "I wanted to," Maggie replied, and realized she meant it completely. "How was school?" Emma launched into a detailed account of her day, describing her teacher Miss Adams and her best friend, Sarah, and the arithmetic problems that had given her trouble. She spoke with the animation of someone accustomed to having her stories heard and valued. and Maggie found herself charmed by the child's enthusiasm and intelligence. "Papa says you used to teach children back in Illinois," Emma said, settling at the kitchen table with her slate to work on arithmetic. "Do you miss it?" The question caught Maggie unprepared. She had taught briefly in a one-room schoolhouse, but her height and unmarried status had made the school board uncomfortable. They'd found reasons to replace her with someone more conventional, someone who wouldn't tower over the older boys or inspire awkward questions from curious parents. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "I enjoyed helping children learn." Emma's pencil paused over her slate. "Maybe you could help me with my sums. I'm terrible with anything past addition, and Papa tries, but numbers make him grumpy." Maggie pulled a chair close to Emma's and looked at the problems covering the slate. They were indeed challenging for an 8-year-old. Complex subtraction and beginning multiplication that would test anyone's patience. But as she began to explain the concepts, breaking them down into manageable pieces, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. The satisfaction of watching understanding dawn in a child's eyes, the pleasure of making difficult things simple through patient explanation. They worked together until Tom's heavy footsteps sounded on the porch and Emma jumped up to greet him with her characteristic enthusiasm. He entered looking tired but content, his clothes dusty with sawdust and his hair damp with honest sweat. When he saw Maggie helping Emma with her schoolwork, his expression softened in a way that made something flutter in her chest. "How was your day?" he asked, directing the question to both of them, but looking primarily at Maggie. "Miss Maggie made bread," Emma announced, "and she helped me understand fractions. I think I might actually be good at arithmetic after all." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite an accomplishment. Emma's been struggling with numbers since the term started." Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks at the approval in his voice. "She's very bright. She just needed someone to explain things differently." They fell into an evening routine that felt both new and familiar. Tom washed up while Maggie and Emma prepared supper, the three of them moving around each other in the small kitchen with surprising ease. Conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything from Emma's school projects to Tom's work at the mill to Maggie's observations about the mountain weather. After supper, while Emma worked on her reading assignment, Tom and Maggie found themselves sitting by the fire with cups of coffee, the comfortable silence of two adults at the end of a productive day settling between them. "You didn't have to spend your day cleaning," Tom said quietly, his voice low enough not to disturb Emma's concentration. "I know," Maggie replied. "I wanted to contribute something." He nodded slowly, staring into the fire. "Most folks back east think frontier life is all hardship and isolation. They don't understand that there's satisfaction in building something with your own hands, in being part of a community that depends on each other." "I'm beginning to see that," Maggie sighed. "There's something honest about this life. Direct." "Direct," Tom repeated, as if testing the word. "I suppose that's true. Not much room for pretense when survival depends on everyone doing their part." They sat in companionable quiet, watching the flames dance and listening to Emma's quiet murmuring as she sounded out difficult words. Maggie found herself studying Tom's profile in the firelight, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his large hands held his coffee cup with surprising delicacy. Everything about him spoke of competence and reliability, qualities she'd learned to value far more than the flashy charm that had attracted her to unsuitable men in the past. "Tom," she said softly, then paused, uncertain how to voice what she was thinking. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes patient and encouraging. "Thank you," she said finally, "for taking a chance on someone you'd never met, for trusting me with your home and your daughter." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that made her pulse quicken. "Thank you for coming all this way on." Nothing but a promise from a stranger. That took considerable courage. Or considerable desperation, she said with a self-deprecating smile. "Sometimes they're the same thing," he replied, and there was something in his voice that suggested he understood desperation better than his calm exterior might indicate. The next morning brought the first real test of their arrangement. Tom left for the mill as usual, but Emma woke with a fever and a cough that made Maggie's chest tight with concern. The child was clearly unwell but trying to hide it, insisting she felt fine enough for school even as she swayed on her feet. "Back to bed, young lady," Maggie said firmly, placing a cool hand on Emma's burning forehead. "School can wait." Emma's eyes filled with tears of frustration. "But Papa will worry if I'm sick. He has enough to think about without adding me to his troubles." The words revealed so much about the burden this child had taken on, trying to be strong for a father who was already stretched thin. Maggie's heart ached for both of them, for the weight of responsibility that had fallen on such young shoulders, and for Tom's struggle to be everything his daughter needed. "Your father would want to know if you're unwell," Maggie said gently, "and he'd want you to rest so you can get better faster." She spent the day nursing Emma through the fever, making cool compresses and coaxing the child to drink water and broth. It was the kind of intimate caregiving that required patience and tenderness, qualities Maggie hadn't been sure she possessed. But as the hours passed and Emma's fever gradually broke, she felt a deep satisfaction in having provided comfort when it was needed most. When Tom returned that evening to find his daughter pale but clearly on the mend, his relief was palpable. He knelt beside Emma's bed, his large hand gentle on her small forehead, his voice soft with concern and gratitude. "Miss Maggie took good care of me, Papa," Emma said weakly but with conviction. She knew just what to do. Tom's eyes met Maggie's over his daughter's head, and the gratitude there was so intense it made her breath catch. In that moment, she realized she had passed some crucial test, proven herself capable of caring for what mattered most to him. Later, after Emma had fallen into healthy sleep, Tom found Maggie in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of the sickroom supplies. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "When Emma gets sick, I never know if I'm doing the right things. Having someone who knows about nursing, about children." He trailed off, running a hand through his dark hair. "She's a wonderful child," Maggie said simply. "It was no hardship to care for her." Tom studied her face in the lamplight, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken. Not just gratitude, but a deeper recognition, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You're not what I expected," he said finally, disappointed. The question slipped out before she could stop it, carrying all her old insecurities about being too much for any man to handle. "No," he said, and his voice was firm with conviction. Not disappointed at all. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Maggie rose early to help with breakfast, spent her days maintaining the household and exploring her new surroundings, and found genuine pleasure in Emma's company and Tom's quiet presence. The child's health returned quickly, along with her irrepressible curiosity and chatter, and Maggie discovered she had a talent for the patient guidance Emma needed. But it was the evenings she treasured most, when the three of them gathered around the fire and talked about everything and nothing. Tom proved to be more thoughtful and well-read than his practical exterior suggested, with opinions on literature and politics that sparked interesting conversations. Emma contributed her own observations with the earnestness of childhood, and somehow their different perspectives blended into something that felt remarkably like family. One evening, as Maggie helped Emma prepare for bed, the child looked up at her with serious blue eyes. "Miss Maggie, are you going to stay with us? Really stay, I mean, not just until you find something better?" The question hit deeper than Maggie had expected. In the week since her arrival, she had begun to feel something she'd never experienced before. Not just welcome, but necessary. Needed in a way that had nothing to do with her ability to work hard or take up less space, but everything to do with the unique contributions she could make to this small family. "I'd like to stay, Emma," she said honestly. "If your father wants me to, and if you want me to." Emma's face lit up with pure joy. "Oh, I do want you to. Papa smiles more now, and the house feels warmer, and you make the best bread in the whole territory." Maggie laughed softly at the child's priorities, but she understood what Emma was really saying. In the space of a week, she had begun to make this place her own, and they had begun to make space for her in their lives. It wasn't the grand passion of romantic novels, but it was something perhaps more valuable: partnership, mutual respect, and the quiet satisfaction of lives that fit together well. Standing in the doorway watching Emma settle under her quilts, Maggie felt a peace she'd never known before. For the first time in her adult life, her size felt like an asset rather than a liability. In this place, with these people, she wasn't too tall or too strong or too much. She was exactly what was needed. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called to its mate. But inside the cabin, warmth and belonging wrapped around them like the finest quilt, carefully stitched together with patience and hope, and the beginning of something that might, in time, become love. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider whose horse steamed in the cold mountain air. Maggie was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the hoofbeats, her hands stilling on the wet fabric as something cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in her stomach. Letters in Pine Ridge were rare enough to be events, and this one bore the unmistakable script of someone from her past. Emma came running from the house, her face bright with curiosity. "Miss Maggie, there's a man at the door asking for you. He's got a letter and everything." The writer was young, maybe 16, with the eager efficiency of someone who took his job seriously. He handed over the envelope with a tip of his hat and a polite nod before remounting and heading back down the mountain trail. Maggie stared at the return address, her heart sinking as she recognized the careful penmanship of her cousin Ruth in Chicago. She waited until Emma had gone back to her morning chores before opening the letter, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the familiar stationery. Ruth's words were as precisely chosen as always, but the urgency beneath them was unmistakable. "Dearest Margaret," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well in your mountain home. I write with news that may interest you. Henry Morrison has recently inherited his uncle's mercantile business and has been making inquiries about your whereabouts. He seems to have undergone something of a transformation in recent months and has spoken frequently of his regret regarding your previous understanding. He has asked me to convey his hope that you might consider returning to Illinois to renew your acquaintance. He is prepared to offer marriage on terms far more generous than his previous hesitation would suggest." Maggie's hands tightened on the paper as she read on. Ruth described Henry's newfound prosperity, his apparent maturity, and his repeated assertions that he had been a fool to let concerns about her height override her many virtues. The letter painted a picture of a man transformed by loss into someone capable of appreciating what he had carelessly discarded. "I know you have made a new life for yourself," Ruth continued, "but I felt obligated to pass along his message. Henry is prepared to travel to Oregon to court you properly if you would consent to see him. He wishes me to tell you that he has learned the difference between a wife who makes a man look important and one who makes him truly important. I leave the decision entirely in your hands, but I wanted you to know that the opportunity exists should you desire it." The letter concluded with family news and expressions of affection, but Maggie barely saw the words. Her mind was fixed on the image of Henry Morrison, the man who had courted her faithfully for 3 months before admitting that the thought of being shorter than his wife on their wedding day made him feel diminished. He had been kind about it, apologetic even, explaining that it wasn't her fault but simply his own weakness. He had offered to remain friends, to help her find someone more suitable, someone who wouldn't be bothered by what he called her magnificent stature. She had been gracious in accepting his rejection, had even thanked him for his honesty. But the wound had gone deeper than she let on, confirming every doubt she'd ever harbored about her chances of finding love. If Henry Morrison, with his genuine fondness for her conversation and his appreciation for her intelligence, couldn't overlook her height, what man could? Now apparently, Henry had discovered the answer to that question. Prosperity had a way of changing a man's perspective on what constituted important qualities in a wife. A successful merchant could afford to have a tall wife, could even take pride in her unusual stature as a sign of his own confidence and success. Maggie folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket, but the words seemed to burn against her ribs. Emma's cheerful humming drifted from the kitchen, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the steady rhythm of Tom's axe as he split wood for the coming winter. The sounds of her new life, of the place where she had begun to believe she belonged. But doubt was a persistent companion, one that had been her shadow for too many years to be easily dismissed. What if she was fooling herself about Tom's feelings? What if his quiet kindness was simply practical gratitude for household help and childcare? What if she was nothing more to him than a useful arrangement, someone tall enough to reach the high shelves and strong enough to manage the heavy work, but not someone he could ever truly want as a wife? Henry's offer represented security, a return to the familiar world of her childhood, marriage to a man who now claimed to value her despite her height, rather than someone who might simply be making the best of circumstances. It was tempting in ways she didn't want to acknowledge, even to herself. The morning passed in a haze of domestic tasks performed without her usual attention. She burned the biscuits, oversalted the soup, and found herself staring out the window at nothing while Emma chattered obliviously about her plans for the day. When Tom returned for the midday meal, his gray eyes immediately found hers with the perceptiveness she had come to associate with him. "Something wrong?" he asked quietly, settling his long frame into his chair at the kitchen table. Maggie forced a smile. "Just wool gathering, nothing important." But Tom's gaze lingered on her face, and she saw the exact moment he decided not to press the issue. It was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him, his understanding that some troubles needed space to breathe before they could be shared. Still, she felt his concern like a warm presence throughout the meal, steady and patient and utterly reliable. Emma filled the silence with animated descriptions of her morning lessons and her excitement about the upcoming barn raising at the Henderson place. The entire community would gather to help raise the frame of their new barn, and Emma had been given permission to help serve food to the workers alongside the other women. "Miss Maggie, you'll come too, won't you?" Emma asked, her blue eyes bright with anticipation. "Mrs. Henderson specifically asked Papa to make sure you'd be there. She wants to meet you proper-like." Tom's expression was carefully neutral. "Only if Maggie wants to go. It'll be the first time most folks get a real look at her, and some of them can be curious." The protective note in his voice should have warmed her, but instead, it made the letter in her pocket feel heavier. Was he protecting her out of genuine affection, or simply being considerate of someone under his temporary care? "I'd like to go," she said, meaning it despite her complicated feelings. "It's time I met our neighbors. Our neighbors." Tom repeated the phrase so quietly she almost missed it, but something in his tone made her look up sharply. His gray eyes held hers for a moment that stretched longer than casual conversation required, and she felt her pulse quicken despite her uncertainty. The rest of the day passed with painful normalcy. Tom returned to his work at the mill. Emma settled down with her afternoon studies, and Maggie threw herself into preparing for the barn, raising with an energy that bordered on frantic. She planned what to cook, what to wear, how to present herself to a community that would be evaluating her worthiness to join their number. But underneath the practical preparations, Ruth's letter burned like a brand against her conscience. She found herself imagining Henry's reaction to seeing her in this setting, surrounded by the rugged practicality of frontier life. Would he still want to marry her if he saw her hauling water and splitting kindling, her hands rough from honest work and her face tanned from mountain sun. The thought brought her up short. When had she stopped caring what Henry Morrison thought of her? When had his approval ceased to matter in the face of Emma's easy affection and Tom's quiet regard? That evening, as they settled into their customary places around the fire, Maggie found herself studying the man who had become such an important part of her daily existence. Tom sat with a book in his lap, reading glasses perched on his nose. As he worked through what appeared to be a technical manual about lumber milling, the lamplight caught the silver threads beginning to show in his dark hair, and she noticed the way his large hands handled the delicate pages with surprising gentleness. Emma curled up on the rug at his feet, ostensibly working on her arithmetic, but actually listening as Tom occasionally read interesting passages aloud. It was a scene of domestic contentment that would have seemed impossible to Maggie just weeks ago, when she had been alone in her father's empty house, convinced that this kind of belonging was beyond her reach. "Papa," Emma said suddenly, looking up from her slate, "when are you and Miss Maggie going to get married?" The question hit the quiet room like a stone thrown into still water. Tom's book slipped in his hands, and Maggie felt heat flood her cheeks in a wave that seemed to start from her toes. "Emma," Tom said carefully, "that's not something you should assume." "But you like each other," Emma persisted with the relentless logic of childhood. "And Miss Maggie makes you smile more than you have since Mama died. And she makes the house feel like a home instead of just a place where we sleep. Out of the mouths of babes." Emma's observation cut straight to the heart of something Maggie had been trying not to acknowledge. In the week since her arrival, she had indeed transformed this cabin from a functional shelter into something warmer, something that felt lived in and loved. But was that enough foundation for a marriage? Was domestic compatibility the same thing as the deeper connection she had always hoped to find? Tom set down his book and removed his reading glasses, buying time while he formulated a response. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Miss Maggie and I are still getting to know each other. Emma, marriage is something that shouldn't be rushed into, especially when there are children involved who might be affected by adult decisions." It was a reasonable answer, the kind of measured response she should have expected from a man like Tom, but something in the careful distance of his words made the letter in her pocket feel like it was burning through the fabric. "I understand," Emma said, though her expression suggested she found the adult world unnecessarily complicated. "I just want you to be happy, Papa, and Miss Maggie too." "We want that as well," Tom replied, and his eyes found Maggie's across the room. Happiness isn't always as simple as wanting it, though. Later, after Emma had been tucked into bed and the dishes cleared away, Tom and Maggie found themselves alone in the main room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and outside the wind moved through the pines with its customary mountain song. It should have been peaceful, but the weight of unspoken things made the silence feel thick and complicated. "I'm sorry about Emma's question," Tom said finally, staring into the flames. "She's gotten attached to you, and children see things in simple terms." "She's not wrong, though," Maggie replied quietly. "We do need to figure out what this arrangement actually is." Tom turned to look at her, his expression serious. "What do you want it to be?" The question was direct, honest, typically Tom in its lack of decorative language. But it also put the burden of definition squarely on her shoulders, and Maggie found herself floundering for an answer that would be equally honest without revealing the depth of her uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been in a situation like this before." "Neither have I," Tom said, and something in his voice suggested the admission cost him something. "I married Emma's mother because we loved each other, but that was different. We were young, and there wasn't a child to consider, and we had all the time in the world to figure things out as we went." Maggie heard what he wasn't saying. This time there was Emma to think about, a little girl who had already lost one mother, and who was clearly hoping for another. This time they were both older, more cautious, carrying wounds that made them careful about risking their hearts. This time the stakes felt higher and the outcome less certain. Emma asked me today if I was going to stay, Maggie said. Really stay, she said. Not just until I found something better. What did you tell her? That I wanted to stay, if you and she wanted me to. She paused, gathering courage for the harder question. But I need to know what that means to you, Tom. Am I a housekeeper who happens to help with Emma? A convenient arrangement that makes your life easier? Or am I someone you could actually see as a wife? The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of settling logs and the distant call of a night bird. Tom's face was thoughtful, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered his answer. You're someone who's become essential to the happiness of this house, he said. Finally, Emma lights up when you walk into a room. The cabin feels different with you in it, warmer and more alive. You've taken care of us both in ways I didn't even realize we needed. It was a beautiful answer, but it didn't address the core of her. Question. Maggie felt the letter crinkle in her pocket as she shifted position, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. But is that enough for marriage? She pressed. Gratitude and domestic compatibility? Tom's expression shifted, and she saw something that might have been hurt flicker across his features. Is that what you think this is, gratitude? I don't know what to think, Maggie said, and the words came out more sharply than she intended. You're a good man, Tom, but you're also practical. I know I'm useful to you. I know Emma needs feminine guidance. I know this arrangement makes sense for everyone involved. But I need to know if there's more to it than that. Tom stood abruptly, his height making the room feel suddenly smaller. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the darkness, his broad shoulders tense beneath his work shirt. My first wife used to tell me I thought too much, he said quietly. That I analyzed everything until I'd talked myself out of trusting my instincts. He turned back to face her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. My instincts tell me that you're the answer to prayers I didn't know I was praying. But my head tells me to be careful, to make sure I'm not asking you to settle for less than you deserve. The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he was showing her, should have reassured her. Instead, it made the weight of Henry's letter feel almost unbearable. Here was Tom struggling to balance his feelings against his sense of responsibility, while she sat hiding an offer that might change everything. What if I told you I had options? She said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. What if staying here wasn't my only choice? Tom's eyes sharpened, and she saw him go very still. Do you? Maggie reached into her pocket and pulled out Ruth's letter, her hands trembling slightly as she held it out to him. This came this morning. Tom took the letter without comment and read it slowly, his expression growing more guarded with each line. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her, his face revealing nothing of what he was thinking. Henry Morrison, he said finally. The man who let you go because you were too tall. The same. Maggie tucked the letter back into her pocket, feeling like she had crossed some invisible line. Apparently prosperity has broadened his perspective on what constitutes an acceptable wife. And you're considering his offer. It wasn't a question, and the flatness in Tom's voice made something twist painfully in her chest. She wanted to deny it, to assure him that Henry's letter meant nothing to her, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was more complicated than simple dismissal, and Tom deserved honesty even if it hurt them both. I don't know, she said quietly. 3 months ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Henry was everything I thought I wanted in a husband. Educated, successful, from a good family. The fact that he couldn't accept my height was devastating, but it didn't change my feelings for him overnight. Tom nodded slowly, and she could see him processing her words with the same careful consideration he brought to everything else. And now I'm not sure what I want, Maggie admitted. Being here with you and Emma has shown me things about myself I didn't know existed. I'm stronger than I thought, more capable of building something meaningful from nothing. But I'm also scared that I'm fooling myself about belonging here, about being wanted for more than my practical skills." Tom walked back to his chair and sat down heavily, his large frame seeming to carry more weight than usual. "What would convince you that you belong here?" The question was simple, but the answer felt impossibly complex. How could she explain the years of feeling too big, too strong, too much for any man to truly want? How could she make him understand that Henry's rejection had confirmed every doubt she'd ever had about her ability to inspire genuine desire rather than resigned acceptance? "I need to know that you want me," she said finally, the words barely above a whisper. "Not because I'm useful, not because Emma needs a mother, not because it's a practical arrangement that benefits everyone involved. I need to know that you want me, specifically me, in a way that has nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with choice." Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression she couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, with something that sounded like frustrated honesty. "I've wanted you since the day you walked into Jenkins' store, and I realized I finally wasn't the biggest person in the room," he said. "I've wanted you when I watch you braiding Emma's hair, and when I come home to find you've mended my shirts, and when you laugh at something my daughter says. I've wanted you in ways that have nothing to do with household management and everything to do with the fact that being near you makes me feel less alone in the world." The raw honesty in his words hit her like a physical blow, and Maggie felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. This was what she had needed to hear, the assurance that she was wanted for herself rather than her usefulness. But hearing it now, with Henry's letter burning in her pocket, felt like a cruel twist of timing. "Tom," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not going to ask you to choose," he said quietly. "If Morrison can offer you something I can't, if going back to Illinois feels like the right decision, then you should do what's best for your future." The generosity in his response, the way he was willing to put her happiness above his own desires, only made her confusion more acute. Henry was offering security, familiarity, a return to the world she had known. Tom was offering uncertainty, frontier life, and a love that felt both deeper and more fragile than anything she had experienced before. "I need time to think," she said finally. Tom nodded, though she could see the cost of his understanding in the tightness around his eyes. "Take all the time you need. But Maggie?" He waited until she met his gaze. "Whatever you decide, don't let fear be the thing that makes the choice for you." That night, Maggie lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, Ruth's letter spread open on the quilt beside her. Outside, the mountain wind sang its ancient song through the pines, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the creek that had given this place its name. The sounds of her new world, the place where she had begun to believe she might finally belong. But belonging was a fragile thing, easily shattered by doubt and old wounds. As dawn began to lighten the sky beyond her window, Maggie still had no answer to the choice that lay before her. Only the knowledge that whatever she decided would change the course of her life forever, and that there was no guarantee that any path would lead to the happiness she had spent so many years seeking. The Henderson barn raising dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the meadow grass like scattered diamonds. Maggie rose before sunrise, her stomach tight with anticipation and nerves, as she prepared for her first real introduction to Pine Ridge society. She had chosen her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and spent extra time arranging her auburn hair in a style that was practical yet feminine. The letter from Henry still lay folded in her drawer, a constant reminder of the choice that weighed on her mind. Tom hitched the wagon while Emma bounced around the kitchen, chattering about all the people Maggie would meet and the games the children would play while the adults worked. The child's excitement was infectious, but Maggie caught Tom watching her with quiet concern, as if he could sense the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly as he helped her into the wagon, his large hands steady on her waist. "As ready as anyone can be for public scrutiny," she replied, attempting lightness but hearing the strain in her own voice. The ride to the Henderson place took them through some of the most beautiful country Maggie had ever seen. Ancient pines towered on both sides of the narrow trail, their branches heavy with snow that sparkled in the morning sun. The air was so clean it seemed to ring like crystal when she breathed it in, and despite her nervousness, she felt her spirits lift at the sheer magnificence of the landscape. Other wagons converged on the Henderson property from various directions, creating a steady stream of neighbors coming together for the common purpose. Maggie recognized some faces from her brief visit to town, but most were strangers who would form their opinions of her based on this single day. The thought made her shoulders tense, but Tom's steady presence beside her provided an anchor of calm. The Henderson homestead buzzed with organized activity that spoke of a community accustomed to working together. Men sorted lumber and gathered tools while women unpacked food and arranged tables for the midday meal. Children ran in excited clusters, their voices bright with anticipation. Everyone seemed to know exactly what needed doing and where they fit into the larger effort. Clara Jenkins spotted them immediately and bustled over with the determination of a woman on a mission. She wore her best dress and an expression of barely contained curiosity as she approached their wagon. "Margaret, dear, you look lovely," Clara said, her eyes taking in every detail of Maggie's appearance with frank assessment. "Come along and let me introduce you to everyone. Tom, you go join the men. We'll take good care of your bride-to-be." The casual assumption in Clara's words made Maggie's cheeks burn. But before she could correct the misconception, she found herself swept into a whirlwind of introductions. The women of Pine Ridge were a hearty bunch, practical in their dress and direct in their manner, but their curiosity about the tall stranger was tempered with genuine warmth. Martha Henderson, a robust woman with graying hair and capable hands, greeted Maggie with a firm handshake and an approving nod. "So you're the one who's finally got Tom Sawyer smiling again. Lord knows that man needed someone to shake him out of his solitary ways. Mrs. Patterson here runs the boarding house," Clara continued, gesturing to a thin woman with sharp eyes and an assessing manner. "And this is Sarah Mills, whose husband works alongside Tom at the mill." Each introduction brought new scrutiny. Polite questions about her background and not-so-subtle evaluations of her suitability for frontier life. Maggie answered as honestly as she could while navigating the complex social currents of a close-knit community meeting an outsider for the first time. "You're certainly tall enough to keep up with Tom," laughed Betty Morrison, a plump woman with kind eyes and flour permanently embedded under her fingernails. "My late husband always said a woman should be able to look her man in the eye when she's giving him a piece of her mind." The comment drew chuckles from the other women, but Maggie felt the familiar sting of having her height be the first thing people noticed about her. Even here, among people who seemed to accept her presence, she was defined primarily by her unusual stature rather than her character or capabilities. "Height's got nothing to do with strength of character," said a voice from behind them, and Maggie turned to see an elderly woman approaching with the careful gait of someone whose bones had earned their rest. "I'm Agnes Cooper, been in these mountains longer than most of these trees, and I'll tell you something, child. The measure of a person isn't in how they're built, but in what they build with what they've got." The older woman's words carried the weight of experience, and Maggie felt some of her tension ease. Agnes Cooper had the look of someone who had seen enough of life to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance. As the morning progressed, Maggie found herself drawn into the rhythm of communal work. She helped prepare food, organized supplies, and gradually began to feel less like a curiosity and more like a contributor. The women worked with practiced efficiency, their conversation flowing from practical matters to gentle gossip to shared memories that revealed the deep bonds of a community that had weathered hard times together. The men's work was more visible and dramatic, the raising of the barn frame requiring coordination and strength that showcased each man's particular skills. Maggie found herself watching Tom as he worked, noting how naturally he assumed a leadership role among the other men. His height and strength made him invaluable for the heavy lifting, but it was his calm competence that drew others to seek his guidance. "He's a good man," said a voice beside her, and Maggie turned to find Agnes Cooper watching her with knowing eyes. "Lost his way for a while after his Mary died, but he's found his footing again since you arrived. We're not—" Maggie began, but Agnes waved away her protest. "Child, I've been watching people fall in love for more years than you've been breathing. I know the signs. Question is, do you?" Before Maggie could formulate a response, a commotion near the worksite drew their attention. One of the support beams had shifted unexpectedly, and several men scrambled to stabilize it before someone got hurt. Tom moved with quick efficiency, his voice carrying clearly as he directed the others in securing the frame. "Steady there, Jim. Bill, get another support under that corner. Easy now, we've got it." The crisis passed without injury, but it reminded everyone that barn raising was serious work that required focus and cooperation. The women resumed their food preparation with renewed urgency, knowing the men would be hungry and tired by the time the main structure was complete. Midday brought a break in the work and a chance for the entire community to gather around the long tables laden with food. Maggie found herself seated between Emma and Sarah Mills, with Tom directly across from her. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from weather predictions to plans for the upcoming Harvest Festival. "Miss Thompson," called out Jim Patterson from further down the table, "what do you think of our mountain country compared to Illinois?" The question drew attention from the entire gathering, and Maggie felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes as she considered her answer. This was clearly a test of sorts, a chance for the community to gauge her commitment to their way of life. "It's beautiful beyond anything I imagined," she said honestly. "The mountains make you feel small in the best possible way, like you're part of something much larger and more enduring than yourself." Nods of approval greeted her words, and she could see that her answer had struck the right note. These people were proud of their home and wanted to know that newcomers appreciated what they had built here. "Course, beautiful don't keep you warm in January," added Bob Henderson with a grin. "Hope you're ready for some real winter weather." "I've been chopping kindling since I was 12, Maggie replied. "I figure I can handle whatever the mountains want to throw at me." This drew outright laughter and what appeared to be genuine approval. These were practical people who valued competence and resilience above decorative accomplishments. As the afternoon wore on and the barn frame took shape against the sky, Maggie began to understand something fundamental about this community. These people had chosen to build their lives in a place that demanded cooperation and mutual support. They couldn't afford to judge each other by superficial standards, when survival often depended on everyone contributing their particular strengths. Emma had gravitated toward a group of children playing elaborate games among the construction debris, her laughter ringing clear in the mountain air. Watching her, Maggie felt a fierce protective surge that surprised her with its intensity. Somewhere in the past weeks, this child had claimed a permanent place in her heart. "She's taken to you something wonderful," observed Martha Henderson, following Maggie's gaze. "That child was too serious for too long after her mother passed. Good to see her being a little girl again." "She's easy to love," Maggie replied softly, meaning every word. "Children know who belongs in their lives," Martha said, with the authority of someone who had raised 6 of her own. "They don't pretend to feel things they don't feel, and they don't withhold affection from people who deserve it." The work continued through the afternoon, with impressive progress on the barn structure. Maggie found herself genuinely enjoying the company of these women, their practical wisdom and unpretentious friendship offering something she had never found in the more refined social circles of her youth. Here, A woman was valued for her contributions rather than her ability to ornament a man's social position. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the construction site, Maggie excused herself for a brief walk to clear her head. The events of the day had given her much to think about, and she needed space to process the warmth of community acceptance against the uncertainty of her future. She walked to the edge of the Henderson property, where the cleared land gave way to forest, and stood looking out over the valley spread below. The view was spectacular, with the settlement of Pine Ridge visible in the distance, and the lumber mill's smoke rising against the darkening sky. This was a good place, she realized, a place where people could build meaningful lives if they were willing to work for them. Maggie. She turned to find Tom approaching, his work shirt damp with honest sweat and his hair disheveled from the day's labor. Even tired and dusty, he moved with the quiet confidence that she had come to associate with him, and her heart did something complicated in response to his presence. "Taking a break from the social whirlwind?" he asked, coming to stand beside her at the forest's edge. "Something like that," she replied. "It's been quite a day." "The women like you," Tom observed. "I could tell from watching their faces during the meal. That's not always a given in a place like this." Maggie appreciated his honesty about the challenges of community acceptance. "They seem to be willing to judge me by my actions rather than my appearance. That's more than I found in other places." Tom was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes studying her profile in the fading light. "You've been thinking about Morrison's letter." It wasn't a question, and Maggie didn't attempt to deny it. "It's hard not to think about it. He's offering everything I thought I wanted when I was younger. Security," Tom said flatly, "among other things." Maggie turned to face him fully, needing to see his expression as they navigated this conversation. "Tom, what we have here, it's wonderful, but it's also uncertain. I don't know what you really want from me, what kind of future you're envisioning. Henry is offering a clear path forward." Tom's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "And that appeals to you." "The certainty appeals to me," Maggie corrected. "I've spent too many years feeling like I don't quite fit anywhere. Henry is offering a place where I would fit, where my height wouldn't be an issue because he's decided he can overlook it for the sake of having a capable wife." "Overlook it," Tom repeated, and something in his tone made her look at him more sharply. "Yes, he's mature enough now to see past physical considerations to the practical advantages of our match." Tom was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been anger. "Maggie, do you hear yourself? You're talking about a man who wants to overlook your height, to see past it to find your value. As if your height were something shameful that needs to be ignored rather than one of the things that makes you magnificent." The word magnificent hit her like a physical blow, unexpected and powerful. She stared at him, seeing something fierce and protective in his gray eyes that took her breath away. "I'm 6 feet and 3 inches tall," she said quietly. "That's not magnificent. That's inconvenient." Tom stepped closer, his height allowing him to look down into her eyes without her having to crane her neck upward. "You're 6 feet and 3 inches of strength and grace and competence. You can reach things other people can't reach, carry things other people can't carry, stand up to challenges that would flatten someone smaller. When I see you braiding Emma's hair, or hanging laundry, or splitting kindling, I don't see someone whose height needs to be overlooked. I see someone whose height is part of what makes her perfect for this life." Maggie felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words and the conviction behind them. "Tom, Morrison wants a wife he can tolerate despite her height," Tom continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I want a wife I can celebrate because of hers. I want someone who can stand beside me as an equal, who doesn't make me feel like I have to make myself smaller to accommodate her comfort." The honesty in his declaration shattered something that had been carefully protected in Maggie's heart. For the first time in her adult life, Someone was telling her that her height wasn't a flaw to be overcome, but a strength to be valued. Not tolerated, not overlooked, but celebrated. "I'm scared," she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside her chest. Of what? Of believing this is real. Of letting myself trust that someone could actually want me the way I am instead of despite the way I am. Of taking a chance on something uncertain when I could have something safe. Tom reached up and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, his touch gentle despite the strength in his fingers. "Safety is an illusion, Maggie. The only real security comes from building something strong enough to weather whatever storms come. I can't promise you an easy life, but I can promise you an honest one. I can promise you'll never have to pretend to be smaller than you are to earn my love." The word love hung between them, spoken for the first time with clear intention. Maggie felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble completely under the weight of it. "I love you too," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "That's what scares me most. I love you and Emma and this life we've built together, and I'm terrified that it's too good to be real." Tom's expression softened, and he leaned down to rest his forehead against hers. "It's real, Maggie, we're real. What we've built together is real, and it's worth fighting for." In the distance, they could hear voices calling their names, the community gathering preparing to head home as darkness settled over the mountains. But for this moment, they stood together at the edge of the forest, two people who had found in each other something they hadn't dared to hope for. "What about Morrison's letter?" Tom asked quietly. Maggie reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded paper, looking at it for a long moment before meeting Tom's eyes. "Henry wants to marry someone he can tolerate." "You want to marry someone you can love. I think I know which one I choose." Without ceremony, she tore the letter in half, then in half again, letting the pieces scatter on the mountain wind. Tom watched the paper disappear into the gathering darkness, and when he looked back at her, his smile was radiant with relief and joy. "Does this mean you'll have me?" he asked, his voice gentle with hope. "If you'll have me," she replied, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him softly. Even with her height, she still had to reach up to him, and the sensation of being the smaller one in an embrace filled her with a dizzy happiness she had never experienced before. They walked back to the barn, raising together, Tom's arm around her shoulders and her heart full of certainty at last. The community was indeed preparing to depart, families loading into wagons and calling their farewells across the moonlit yard. Emma spotted them approaching and ran to meet them, her face bright with excitement. "Miss Maggie, Mrs. Henderson, wants to know if you're coming to the Harvest Festival next month. I told her of course you are, because you live here now." "I wouldn't miss it," Maggie said, catching the child up in a hug that lifted her off the ground. "After all, this is my home now." Emma's delighted laughter rang across the yard, and Maggie caught sight of several women nodding their approval at the obvious affection between them. Agnes Cooper raised her hand in a small salute, her weathered face creased with satisfaction. On the ride home, with Emma curled asleep between them and the wagon wheels crunching softly over the frost-hardened trail, Tom reached over to take Maggie's hand. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Maggie looked up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the mountain sky, then at the sleeping child who had claimed her heart, and finally at the man who had taught her that love didn't require her to be smaller than she was. "None," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I belong." 6 months later, on a morning when wildflowers carpeted the mountain meadows and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Margaret Thompson became Margaret Sawyer in a simple ceremony at the Pine Ridge Chapel. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to accommodate her height, and carried wildflowers picked by Emma from their own garden. Tom stood waiting for her at the altar, magnificent in his Sunday best, his gray eyes warm with love and certainty. When Pastor Hayes asked if anyone objected to their union, The silence was complete, except for the sound of Agnes Cooper's satisfied chuckle from the front pew. As they exchanged vows, Maggie realized that she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life. Not someone who would tolerate her differences, but someone who celebrated them. Not a place where she could make herself smaller, but a place where her full stature was not just accepted, but needed. Emma stood beside them as they kissed, her face radiant with joy, and the entire congregation of Pine Ridge rose to their feet in applause. Outside, the mountain stood eternal and welcoming, and the sound of the lumber mill whistle carried on the morning air like a benediction. Margaret Sawyer was finally, completely, perfectly home. 2 years had passed since Margaret Sawyer first stepped off the stagecoach in Pine Ridge, and the woman who now stood at her kitchen window bore little resemblance to the uncertain mail-order bride who had arrived with nothing but a carpetbag and a heart full of doubt. Her auburn hair caught the morning light as she watched her husband and daughter working together in the garden, their heads bent over the summer vegetables that would sustain them through the coming winter. Tom's deep voice carried across the yard as he explained to Emma the proper way to tell when tomatoes were ready for harvest. At 10 years old, Emma had grown tall and strong, her limbs stretching with the promise of Sunday matching her stepmother's impressive height. She listened to her father's instructions with the serious attention she brought to everything, her small hands gentle as she examined the ripening fruit. Maggie smiled as she watched them, her heart full of the quiet contentment that had become her daily companion. The morning sickness that had plagued her for the past month had finally begun to ease, leaving her with an appetite that rivaled Tom's prodigious consumption. She rested a hand on her still flat stomach, marveling at the secret she and Tom had shared for only a week now, a baby. After 2 years of marriage, 2 years of building their life together step by careful step, they were finally going to add to their family. The thought filled her with a mixture of joy and terror that was becoming familiar. At 32, she would be what doctors called an older mother, but Tom's confidence in her strength had helped quiet her worries about the challenges ahead. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the trail that led from town, and she recognized the distinctive figure of Doc Anderson making his way toward their cabin. The good doctor had become a regular visitor since word of her condition had spread, his paternal concern for the welfare of Pine Ridge's residents extending to careful monitoring of expectant mothers. "Tom," she called through the open window. "Doc Anderson's coming up the trail." Her husband straightened from his work, his height making him visible even from a distance. He said something to Emma that made the girl nod seriously before skipping toward the house, her face bright with anticipation. Emma had taken the news of the coming baby with the unqualified delight of a child who had always wanted siblings, and her excitement was infectious. "Morning, Mrs. Sawyer," Doc Anderson called as he dismounted near the porch. "How are you feeling?" "Today? Much better, thank you," Maggie replied, stepping outside to greet him. "The nausea seems to be settling down." Doc Anderson was a small, precise man whose diminutive stature made him appear almost childlike next to the Sawyer family. He had confided to Maggie once that treating the tallest family in Pine Ridge made him feel like he was doctoring a race of gentle giants, but his skill and dedication had earned their complete trust. "That's normal for this stage," he said, settling his medical bag on the porch table. "Most women find the second trimester much more comfortable. Now let's have a look at how you're progressing." The examination was thorough but gentle, Doc Anderson's professional manner putting Maggie at ease despite her natural modesty. Tom hovered nearby, his gray eyes watchful and protective, ready to intervene if his wife showed any sign of discomfort. "Everything looks excellent," Doc Anderson announced, packing away his instruments. "The baby's growing well, and Mrs. Sawyer is handling the pregnancy beautifully. I'd say you're due sometime in early February, just after the worst of the winter. Weather passes." February. Maggie tried to imagine herself heavy with child during the coldest months. when the snow would pile high around their cabin and the wind would howl down from the peaks like a living thing. It would be a challenging time to bring a new life into the world, but she had learned to trust in the rhythm of the seasons and the strength of the community that surrounded them. "Will she need special care?" Tom asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his concern evident to anyone who knew him well. "Mrs. Sawyer is a strong, healthy woman," Doc Anderson replied. "I expect she handled childbirth better than most, given her constitution. But I'll want to see her regularly as the pregnancy progresses, just to make sure everything continues smoothly." Emma, who had been listening from the doorway with barely contained excitement, finally burst into the conversation. "Can I help? Take care of the baby? I know all about babies, because I helped Mrs. Peterson when her twins were born." Doc Anderson chuckled at the girl's enthusiasm. "I'm sure you'll be a wonderful big sister, Emma. Babies need lots of help, and having someone as responsible as you around will make things much easier for your parents." The pride in Emma's face at being called responsible was radiant, and Maggie felt a surge of love for this child who had claimed her heart so completely. Emma had never known a mother's love in her earliest years, but she had embraced Maggie's presence with such wholehearted acceptance that their bond felt as natural as if they had been together from the beginning. After Doc Anderson departed, with promises to return in a month's time, the family settled into the comfortable rhythm of a summer morning. Tom returned to his work in the garden while Maggie and Emma prepared preserves from the early berries Emma had gathered along the creek. The kitchen filled with the sweet scent of cooking fruit and the easy chatter of two females working together toward a common goal. "Mama," Emma said, using the title that had evolved naturally over the past 2 years, "will you teach the baby to be tall like us?" Maggie paused in her stirring, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think the baby will grow to be exactly the right size for who they're meant to be. But we'll certainly teach them to be proud of however tall they turn out to be." Emma nodded thoughtfully, her young mind working through the implications. "Mrs. Henderson says tall women are strong women, and strong women raise strong children. She says you're the strongest woman in Pine Ridge." The compliment, delivered with Emma's characteristic directness, made Maggie's eyes mist with unexpected emotion. 2 years ago, she had seen her height as a burden, something that made her too much for any man to handle. Now, through the eyes of her husband and daughter, she had learned to see it as a source of strength and capability. "Strength comes in many forms," Maggie said gently. "Physical strength is just one kind. You have emotional strength, Emma, and kindness and intelligence. Those are just as important as being able to lift heavy things." The afternoon brought visitors in the form of Clara Jenkins and her sister visiting from Portland. The two women arrived with a basket of fresh bread and enough curiosity to fuel a week's worth of conversation. Clara had appointed herself the unofficial chronicler of Pine Ridge's social developments, and Maggie's pregnancy was clearly the most exciting news to emerge in months. "My goodness, Margaret, you're positively glowing," Clara announced, settling herself at the kitchen table with the air of someone prepared for a lengthy visit. "I told my sister here that we've never had a more beautiful expectant mother in all of Pine Ridge." Clara's sister, a thin woman named Ruth with sharp eyes and fashionable clothes, studied Maggie with unconcealed fascination. Clara's written me all about your romantic story. A mail-order bride who captured the heart of the most eligible bachelor in town. It's like something out of a novel. Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks at being discussed, as if she were a character in a story rather than a real person with real feelings. But she had learned to navigate Clara's well-meaning but intrusive curiosity with patience and grace. "Tom and I were fortunate to find each other," she said diplomatically. "We've built a good life together." "More than good," Clara interjected. "You've transformed that man completely. He used to be so serious, so focused on work and responsibility. Now he actually smiles, and I've seen him laugh out loud at things," Emma says. "That's the power of a good woman's influence. Ruth leaned forward with the intensity of someone gathering material for future gossip. "And now you're starting a family of your own. How wonderful. I suppose being so tall will make childbirth easier for you." The personal nature of the observation made Maggie uncomfortable, but she had learned that frontier communities had different standards of privacy than the more formal society of her youth. "Doc Anderson seems to think everything should progress normally." "Oh, I'm sure it will," Clara said with confidence. "You're built for it, dear. Strong hips, broad shoulders, plenty of room for a growing baby. Not like some of these delicate little things who look like they might break in half." The conversation continued in this vein for the better part of an hour, with Clara providing commentary on the pregnancies and deliveries of every woman in Pine Ridge's recent history. Maggie endured it with as much grace as she could muster, grateful when Tom's return from the mill provided a natural end to the visit. Tom greeted the visitors with polite courtesy, but Maggie could see his relief when they finally departed, their basket empty and their curiosity temporarily satisfied. He waited until their wagon disappeared down the trail before turning to his wife with a wry smile. "Let me guess," he said. "Clara wanted to know everything about your condition, compared you to every other woman who's ever been pregnant in Pine Ridge, and offered enough unsolicited advice to fill a medical textbook." Maggie laughed, the sound carrying across the yard like music. "You know Clara very well. She means well, but sometimes I feel like I'm being studied like a specimen rather than treated like a person." Tom's expression grew serious, and he reached out to take her hands in his much larger ones. "You're not a specimen, Maggie. You're my wife and Emma's mother, and the strongest, most capable woman I've ever known. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're anything less than extraordinary." The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, still had the power to make her breath catch after 2 years of marriage. She had never dreamed that love could feel so solid, so reliable, so completely accepting of every part of who she was. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I love you too," he replied, bending down to kiss her forehead. "Both of you." As summer progressed into autumn, Maggie's pregnancy became more apparent, her tall frame accommodating the growing baby with surprising grace. She continued to work alongside Tom and Emma, her strength and endurance seemingly unaffected by her condition. The women of Pine Ridge watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern, unused to seeing an expectant mother maintain such an active lifestyle. The harvest festival arrived with the turning of the leaves, the entire community gathering to celebrate another successful growing season. Maggie wore her best dress, let out carefully to accommodate her expanding waistline, and felt a deep satisfaction as she looked around at the familiar faces of people who had become her extended family. Emma had entered her preserves in the Weve competition and won second place, her pride evident as she showed off her ribbon to anyone who would listen. Tom had contributed his woodworking skills to the festival preparations, building tables and benches that would serve the community for years to come. Together, they represented the kind of family that Pine Ridge valued, hardworking, reliable, and committed to the welfare of their neighbors. "Margaret," called Agnes Cooper from across the festival grounds, "come here and let me feel that baby." The elderly woman's request was delivered with the authority of someone who had assisted at more births than anyone else in the territory. Maggie obediently approached, knowing that Agnes's experienced hands could tell her things about her pregnancy that even Doc Anderson might miss. Agnes placed her weathered palms on Maggie's rounded stomach, her touch gentle but knowing. The baby responded to the pressure with a series of kicks that made Maggie gasp with surprise and delight. "Strong one," Agnes announced with satisfaction. "Active and healthy. This child's going to be a force to be reckoned with, mark my words." "Like mother, like child," observed Martha Henderson, joining their small circle. "Strong women raise strong children." The afternoon passed in a blur of conversation, food, and the comfortable camaraderie of people who had chosen to build their lives together in this remote corner of the world. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the community gathered for the traditional harvest dance. Maggie watched from the sidelines as couples took to the makeshift dance floor, her advanced pregnancy making participation inadvisable. But she felt no sense of exclusion, only deep contentment as she observed the joy and fellowship that surrounded her. Tom appeared at her side, his hand warm on her shoulder. "Regretting missing the dancing?" "Not at all," she replied honestly. "I have everything I could want right here." Emma bounced up to them, her face flushed with excitement from playing with the other children. "Mama, Mrs. Patterson says the baby might be born during the worst blizzard of the winter. She says mountain babies born in snowstorms are the strongest of all." Maggie smiled at the child's enthusiasm for local folklore. "I suppose we'll find out soon enough. But whether the baby is born in a blizzard or sunshine, they'll be loved and wanted." "The most important thing," Tom agreed, his arm tightening around his wife's shoulders. Winter arrived early that year, with snow beginning to fall in earnest before Thanksgiving. By December, the drifts were piled high around the cabin, and the trail to town was passable only on the clearest days. Maggie's pregnancy had progressed beautifully, her body adapting to the changes with the same strength and resilience she brought to everything else. Doc Anderson had taken to staying in town during the worst weather, but he had left detailed instructions with Tom about what to watch for as Maggie's time approached. Agnes Cooper had also volunteered to assist with the birth, her decades of experience making her as valuable as any trained physician. Christmas brought a brief respite from the bitter cold, and the family celebrated quietly in their warm cabin. Tom had carved a set of wooden toys for Emma and a beautiful cradle for the coming baby. Emma had knitted tiny mittens with painstaking care, and Maggie had sewn a christening gown from fabric saved from her wedding dress. "Next Christmas there will be 4 of us," Emma said dreamily, staring at the cradle by the fire. "4 of us," Maggie agreed, her hand resting on her now prominent stomach. "It's hard to imagine." Tom looked up from the book he was reading, his gray eyes warm with contentment. "I can imagine it perfectly. This house filled with the sound of a baby's laughter, Emma teaching songs and games, all of us together." The picture he painted was so appealing that Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes. 2 years ago, she had been alone and uncertain, convinced that she was too much for any man to love. Now she was surrounded by a family that cherished her, in a community that valued her contributions, expecting a child who would grow up knowing they were wanted and loved. January brought the worst blizzard anyone could remember, with winds that howled like banshees and snow that fell for 3 days straight. The cabin was well built and well stocked, but the isolation was complete. No one could travel in such conditions, and even the short walk to the barn became an adventure requiring careful planning. It was during this storm that Maggie's labor began, starting with subtle contractions that gradually grew stronger and more frequent. Tom recognized the signs immediately, his years of experience with farm animals serving him well in this human crisis. "Emma," he said calmly, "I need you to fetch the supplies we prepared and heat water on the stove." The babies decided to come during the biggest storm of the year. Emma's eyes grew wide with excitement and nervousness, but she responded to her father's calm authority with the maturity that had always made her seem older than her years. She bustled around the cabin, gathering the clean sheets and blankets they had set aside, her movements efficient despite her obvious anxiety. The hours that followed tested every member of the family in different ways. Maggie labored with the stoic determination that characterized everything she did, her height and strength serving her well as she worked to bring their child into the world. Tom provided steady support and encouragement, his large hands gentle as he helped her through each contraction. Emma assisted with fetching and carrying, her presence a comfort despite her youth. As dawn broke over the snow-covered mountains, painting the world in shades of pink and gold, Margaret Sawyer delivered a son who announced his arrival with lusty cries that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. The baby was large and healthy, with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined expression. "He's perfect," Tom whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he held his son for the first time. "Absolutely perfect." Emma leaned over the baby with wide eyes, her face radiant with wonder. "He's so small," she said, then looked up at her parents with sudden concern. "But he'll grow big like us, won't he?" "He'll grow to be exactly who he's meant to be," Maggie said softly, exhausted but glowing with happiness. "And we'll love him no matter how tall he gets." The blizzard raged for another day, but inside the cabin all was warmth and joy. The baby, whom they named James after Tom's father, proved to be as strong and determined as his parents, nursing eagerly and sleeping peacefully in the cradle his father had made with such care. When the storm finally passed and word of the birth spread through Pine Ridge, the cabin was soon filled with visitors bearing gifts and congratulations. Agnes Cooper declared James the finest baby she had ever seen, while Clara Jenkins predicted he would grow to be even taller than his father. "Mountain babies born in blizzards," she announced with authority, "always turn out to be something special." Doc Anderson arrived as soon as the trails were passable, his face creased with concern until he saw for himself that both mother and baby were thriving. His examination revealed that Maggie had handled the birth with remarkable ease, her strong constitution and Tom's capable assistance, making what could have been a dangerous situation into a celebration of life. "You've done beautifully, Mrs. Sawyer," he said with genuine admiration. "I've rarely seen a new mother recover so quickly or a baby so healthy and alert." As spring returned to the mountains, bringing with it the promise of new growth and renewal, the Sawyer family settled into their expanded life with the same steady determination that had carried them through every challenge. James proved to be a content baby, growing rapidly and showing early signs of the intelligence that ran in both sides of his family. Emma embraced her role as big sister with characteristic enthusiasm, helping with feeding and bathing and entertaining the baby with songs and stories. Tom balanced his work at the mill with the demands of a growing family, his face reflecting the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world. And Maggie, watching her husband and children on a warm May morning as she hung laundry on the line, felt the profound contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The woman who had once been told she was too tall for any man to love now stood as the beloved wife and mother of a family that treasured her strength, her capability, and her generous heart. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, solid and eternal, a testament to the enduring power of love that accepts and celebrates rather than merely tolerates. In this place, with these people, Margaret Sawyer had found not just acceptance, but adoration, not just shelter, but a home where her full stature was not just welcomed, but essential. As James gurgled happily in his cradle and Emma chattered about her plans for the summer garden, Maggie smiled and continued her work, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had traveled across a continent to answer the call of an uncertain future, and she had found instead the certain love of a lifetime. The mail-order bride who had once been refused for being too tall had become the cherished wife of a man who made her feel perfectly sized for love, and that was a transformation worth celebrating for all the days of her life. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, 10 years after Margaret Sawyer had first set foot in Pine Ridge. The Western Union messenger, a young man named Billy Peterson, rode his horse hard up the mountain trail, his face grim with the weight of the news he carried. Emma, now 20 years old and nearly as tall as her stepmother, was the first to spot him coming. "Mama, there's a rider coming fast," she called from the porch where she was shelling peas for the evening meal. "He's got the Western Union satchel." Margaret's hands stilled on the bread dough she was kneading, a chill running down her spine. Despite the warm autumn air, Telegrams rarely brought good news to mountain communities, and the urgency of the messenger's approach suggested something serious had happened. Tom emerged from the barn where he had been repairing harnesses, his height and broad shoulders making him immediately recognizable even at a distance. Little James, now 9 years old and already showing signs of inheriting his father's impressive stature, abandoned his play to watch the approaching rider with the keen interest of a child who sensed drama unfolding. "Mrs. Sawyer," Billy called as he reined in his lathered horse. "Telegram for you, ma'am. Come all the way from Chicago." Chicago. Margaret's heart clenched as she accepted the yellow envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized the sender's information. Her cousin Ruth, the only family member who had maintained contact with her over the years, would not have spent the money for a telegram unless something catastrophic had occurred. She tore open the envelope with careful fingers, Tom's reassuring presence beside her as she unfolded the brief message. The words were stark and efficient in the way of telegrams, but their impact was devastating. Henry Morrison died suddenly. Heart attack, funeral Friday. Thought you should know. Your inheritance from father's estate finally settled. Substantial. Some, right soon, Ruth. Margaret read the telegram twice, her mind struggling to process the information. Henry Morrison, the man who had once courted her and then rejected her for being too tall, was dead. And her father's estate, which she had assumed had been consumed by debts and legal fees, had apparently yielded an inheritance significant enough for Ruth to describe as substantial. "What is it?" Tom asked quietly, his gray eyes searching her face for clues about the telegram's contents. Margaret handed him the message without speaking, watching his expression as he read the brief lines. She saw his jaw tighten slightly when he reached Henry's name, but his primary concern was clearly for her well-being rather than any jealousy over her past. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I know you cared for him once." The gentleness in his voice, his immediate assumption that she might be grieving for a lost love, made Margaret's heart swell with affection for this man who had taught her what real love looked like. Henry Morrison's death was shocking, but it did not touch the deep places in her heart that Tom and their children had claimed so completely. "It's sad," she replied honestly. "He was a good man, just not the right man for me. I'm more surprised about the inheritance. I thought father had died leaving nothing but debts." Tom nodded, his practical mind already working through the implications. Ruth wouldn't have called it substantial unless it was significant. This could change things. For us, Emma approached with the careful step of someone trying not to intrude on adult conversations. At 20, she had grown into a striking young woman, her height and strong features making her stand out in any crowd. Several young men in Pine Ridge had expressed interest in courting her, but she had shown little enthusiasm for any of them. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her blue eyes moving between her parents with concern. "There's been a death back in Illinois," Margaret explained gently. "Someone I knew before I came here. And apparently there's been some unexpected financial news as well." James, never one to be left out of family discussions, bounded up to join them. At 9, he was already taller than most boys his age, with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. He had inherited the best qualities of both parents, along with an insatiable curiosity about the world around him. "Are we rich now?" he asked with the directness of childhood. Tom ruffled his son's hair with a gentle hand. "We don't know yet, James, but we're already rich in the things that matter most." The boy considered this seriously, then nodded with satisfaction. "Good. I like being rich in family." Over the following days, Margaret found herself thinking often about Henry Morrison and the life she might have lived if she had accepted his offer to return to Illinois. The news of his death had awakened memories she had thought long buried, not of romantic love, but of the uncertain young woman she had once been. She had been so desperate for acceptance then, so willing to settle for someone who could tolerate her height rather than celebrate it. Henry's renewed interest had offered security and social respectability, everything she had been taught to value in a potential husband. But it had also required her to see herself as fundamentally flawed, someone whose worth lay in overcoming her perceived defects rather than embracing her strengths. The contrast with her life in Pine Ridge could not have been more stark. Here, she was valued not despite her height but because of it. Tom had fallen in love with her strength and capability, while the community had embraced her contributions without requiring her to diminish herself to fit their expectations. Ruth's next letter arrived a week later, providing details about both Henry's death and the inheritance. Henry had built a successful business empire in Chicago, never marrying despite his wealth and social standing. The funeral had been well attended, with numerous speakers praising his generosity and civic contributions. "He asked about you once," Ruth wrote, "about 3 years ago, when he was considering a donation to establish a school for tall children. He said he had made a terrible mistake in letting you go, and that he hoped you had found happiness in your mountain home. I told him you had married and were very content. He smiled and said he was glad, that you deserved someone who appreciated your magnificent spirit." Margaret smiled through tears as she read Henry's final assessment of her character. Magnificent spirit. It was remarkably similar to how Tom had described her during their courtship, and she found comfort in knowing that Henry had eventually understood what he had lost. The inheritance details were indeed impressive. Her father's investments, which had seemed worthless at the time of his death, had eventually yielded significant returns. After legal fees and taxes, Margaret stood to inherit nearly $10,000, a fortune that would make the Sawyers one of the wealthiest families in the territory. $10,000, Tom said quietly when she shared the news with him. That evening, "That's enough to buy half the mountain." They sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, the comfortable silence of a couple who had learned to share their thoughts without constant chatter. Emma was inside helping James with his arithmetic, her patient voice carrying through the open windows. "What do you want to do with it?" Tom asked eventually. Margaret considered the question seriously. The money represented freedom and opportunities she had never dared to imagine. They could move to a larger town, buy a grand house, send James to university back east. They could travel, see the world beyond these mountains, experience luxuries that frontier life had never offered. "I want to stay here," she said finally. "This is our home. These are our people. I want to use the money to make our life here even better." Tom's smile was radiant with relief and approval. "I was hoping you'd say that. I can't imagine living anywhere else." They talked late into the night about their plans for the inheritance. Tom wanted to expand the lumber mill, perhaps build a school for the growing number of children in Pine Ridge. Margaret was interested in establishing a medical clinic, bringing proper health care to the remote community. Emma had expressed interest in teacher training, and the money would allow her to pursue education in Portland or even San Francisco. "We could build a proper library," Margaret suggested, "and maybe a community center where folks could gather for meetings and social events. James could have tutoring to supplement his education," Tom added. "Prepare him for university, if that's what he wants." The possibilities seemed endless, but all of them centered on strengthening the community that had welcomed them and the family they had built together. The inheritance would not change who they were, but it would allow them to become even more fully themselves. The next morning brought unexpected visitors in the form of 2 well-dressed men from Portland, who had apparently traveled to Pine Ridge specifically to meet with Margaret. They introduced themselves as representatives of a women's suffrage organization, having heard about her story through connections in Chicago. "Mrs. Sawyer," said the older man, a distinguished gentleman named William Hayes, "we've heard remarkable things about your journey from Illinois and your contributions to this community. We're organizing a speaking tour to promote women's rights. and we believe your story would resonate powerfully with audiences throughout the West." Margaret felt Tom's surprise beside her, but also his supportive presence as she considered this unexpected opportunity. The idea of speaking publicly about her experiences was both thrilling and terrifying. "What exactly would you want me to talk about?" she asked cautiously. "Your transformation from a woman who felt she had to apologize for her height to one who has built a successful life celebrating her strengths," Hayes replied. "The contrast between accepting tolerance and demanding appreciation. The courage required to leave everything familiar and create something new." The second man, younger and more intense, leaned forward eagerly. "Women across the country are struggling with the same issues you faced. Society tells them they're too much or not enough, that they should be grateful for whatever acceptance they can find. Your story proves that real love and respect are possible when you refuse to settle for less than you deserve." Margaret looked at Tom, seeing pride and encouragement in his gray eyes. "It would mean traveling, being away from home for extended periods. We'd work around your family obligations," Hayes assured her. "Perhaps a few engagements each year, focusing on the larger cities where your message would reach the most people." Emma appeared in the doorway, having overheard the conversation. "Mama, you should do it. Think of all the women who need to hear what you have to say." That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table to discuss the speaking opportunity. James, practical like his father, wanted to know if the travel would be dangerous. Emma was enthusiastic about the chance to make a difference in other women's lives. Tom was supportive, but concerned about the demand such a commitment would place on Margaret. "It's not an easy life, speaking to strangers about personal matters," he said gently. "Are you sure you want to expose yourself to that kind of scrutiny?" Margaret had been thinking about the same question all day. The idea of sharing her story with women who might benefit from her experiences was appealing, but she also valued the privacy and peace of their mountain home. "I think I want to try," she said finally. "Maybe just a few engagements to start with, see how it goes. If it helps even one woman find the courage to demand better for herself, it would be worth it." The decision made, life in Pine Ridge took on new dimensions of possibility and purpose. Margaret began working with the suffrage organization to develop her speaking presentations, while Tom threw himself into plans for expanding the lumber mill with some of the inheritance money. Emma enrolled in a teacher training program in Portland, traveling back and forth between the city and the mountains as her studies required. James, not to be left out of the family's expansion, convinced his parents to let him help with the mill operations during his school breaks. At 9, he was already showing an aptitude for mechanical work and an understanding of business principles that impressed the adult workers. Margaret's first speaking engagement took place in Sacramento, before an audience of 200 women gathered for a suffrage rally. She had prepared extensively, but nothing could have readied her for the emotional impact of sharing her story with strangers who understood exactly what she had experienced. "I spent years believing that my height was a flaw that needed to be overlooked," she told the attentive crowd. "I was grateful for any man who could tolerate my appearance, never imagining that I deserved someone who would celebrate it. It took traveling across a continent to find a man who saw my strength as beautiful rather than threatening." The response was overwhelming. Women approached her after the speech with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of feeling too much or not enough for the world around them. Some had been told they were too tall, others too short, too smart, too independent, too anything that made them inconvenient for societal expectations. "You've given me permission to stop apologizing for who I am," one woman said, grasping Margaret's hands with desperate gratitude. "I've been making myself smaller for so long, I forgot I had a choice." The tour expanded over the following months, taking Margaret to cities throughout California, Oregon, and Washington. She spoke to audiences of working women, society ladies, and frontier wives, finding that her message resonated regardless of social class or geographic location. The inheritance money allowed her to make these trips without financial hardship, and Tom's unwavering support made the emotional demands bearable. He often traveled with her when mill operations permitted, his presence a steady anchor in the sometimes overwhelming world of public speaking. "You're changing lives," he told her one evening as they sat in a hotel room in San Francisco, reviewing letters from women who had attended her speeches. "Look at all these women who are finding the courage to ask for more." Margaret read through the correspondence, her heart full at the evidence of her impact. Women were leaving unsatisfactory relationships, pursuing education, starting businesses, demanding equal treatment in marriages that had been built on inequality. Her story had become a catalyst for transformation in ways she had never imagined. But it was the letter from Emma that touched her most deeply. Her stepdaughter, now studying to become a teacher, had written about the pride she felt in having a mother who was changing the world. "You taught me that being tall was an advantage before I ever knew it might be seen as a problem," Emma wrote. "Because of you, I've never apologized for my height or my strength or my intelligence. I've never settled for someone who merely tolerated me. When I marry, it will be to a man who celebrates everything I am, just like Papa celebrates everything." About you. As Margaret's reputation as a speaker grew, so did the opportunities. She was invited to address legislative sessions, women's colleges, and national conventions. The shy woman who had once hidden her height behind stooped shoulders had become a confident advocate for women's rights and self-acceptance. The success of her speaking career brought attention to Pine Ridge as well. Journalists traveled to the remote mountain community to interview the woman who had become known as the Tall Lady of the Mountains. Their articles brought visitors, new residents, and business opportunities that transformed the tiny settlement into a thriving town. Tom's lumber mill expanded to meet growing demand, employing dozens of men and providing prosperity for the entire community. The school Margaret had funded attracted teachers from across the region, and the medical clinic she had established saved countless lives that might have been lost to the harsh realities of frontier medicine. "You've done more than find your own happiness," Agnes Cooper told Margaret one afternoon as they watched children playing in the town square that had been built with inheritance money. "You've created a place where other people can find theirs too." Margaret smiled as she observed the bustling activity around them. Pine Ridge had grown from a rough logging camp into a proper town, complete with paved streets, electric lighting, and all the amenities that marked a community's transition from survival to prosperity. But more important than the physical improvements was the spirit of the place. Pine Ridge had become known throughout the region as a town where people were valued for their contributions, rather than their conformity to conventional expectations. Tall women, short men, independent thinkers, and unconventional families all found acceptance here. "It's what Tom and I always hoped for," Margaret replied. "A place where being different isn't a disadvantage, but a strength." As the sun set over the mountains that had become her home, Margaret Sawyer reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off a stagecoach 20 years ago had become a confident woman, beloved wife, devoted mother, and influential advocate for women's rights. She had learned that true love didn't require her to be smaller, but celebrated her at her full height. She had discovered that real strength came not from hiding her differences, but from embracing them completely. And she had found that the greatest happiness came from using her gifts to lift others up, rather than diminishing herself to fit in. The mail-order bride who had once been refused for being too tall had become a woman who made the world a bigger, more accepting place for everyone around her. And in doing so, she had found not just love, but a legacy that would endure long after the mountains themselves crumbled into dust. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.